and welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton, the Inflation Guy. I am your host. And today we're going to talk about the CPI report and run through those numbers. And this is the first post-election CPI report. And normally that doesn't really matter because it's not like economics, naturally follows what's happening in the political sphere. But in this particular case, it leaves the Fed in an interesting political position, which is not something that we usually have to worry too much about with the Fed, or at least we never used to have to. And so we'll talk about that. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs, a fast-growing manager of liquid alternative ETFs. Simplify is bringing Wall Street to Main Street by providing access to institutional strategies, perfect for diversifying your equity and bond portfolios. Previously only available to big institutions and the ultra-rich. Check out their website at simplify.us. That's simplify.us. And you can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplify.us/ETFs. So I had said a couple of months ago, I had said a couple of months ago that I didn't think that the Fed should ease, but they would anyway, and they did. And then last month on this podcast, I called it inflation peekaboo because we kind of got, we had a little bit of a disturbing number that was a surprise. This month, what we got wasn't a surprise, but it's continuing a recent pattern that is, let's just say it's unfortunate because it puts the Fed in an uncomfortable position because it looks like inflation is now leveling off kind of where it was prior to the summer. We had these good couple of months, May, June, July, where inflation had kind of ticked down, looked like the Fed was, going to declare victory. Fed was ready to ease. We got a number that wasn't great, but the Fed eased anyway. We got another number that wasn't so great. Fed eased again, only 25 basis points. And now we've had three numbers that aren't so great. And it makes it look like maybe the Fed was accommodating prematurely. Let's look at the number, though, because on one level, this was not much of a surprise. Over the last week or two, the economist estimates have been slowly creeping up because we were getting some information about used cars, and used cars was going to be a big number this month, and that turned out to be the case. And so the forecast had been gradually going up, and right before the number, the consensus expectations for headline was 0.21% seasonally adjusted. We're in the part of the year where non-seasonally adjusted is lower, and so the seasonal adjustments are adding to the headline number. And the consensus for core was 0.28. The actual result was 0.24 on headline and 0.28 on core. So the economists nailed core. Again, after adjusting right here towards the end, but they nailed core. The 0.24 on headline is interesting, almost rounded up, which would have led people to maybe come to a different conclusion, or certainly shaded the way people looked at the number. But the year-on-year figures, 2.58% on the headline, which doesn't sound alarming. It's above consensus, above the Fed's target, which on CPI is probably around 2.25%, but it's not egregious. But core inflation is at 3.3% year on year, and some of that drop is eventually going to be erased. And so median inflation, we haven't gotten the official numbers yet, but it's going to be roughly 0.296 is my calculation, which would keep the year on year median inflation at 4.09%. I always say I think median inflation is a better way to look at inflation even than core. Core gets influenced by things like used cars going wacko, whereas median is much less influenced by that sort of thing. And median inflation has been coming down, but it's coming down at an increasingly slower rate. Is that the right way to say it? It's been decelerating at a decelerating rate. And so now these 2 months we have 4.08 and 4.09 were the year-on-year figures. And longtime listeners will know I've said for quite a long time, couple of years now, that we would end up in the high threes, low fours on median. And that's where we are. And it looks like we're kind of leveling off there. At some point, of course, we're not going to flatline. At some point, we'll go a little bit above, a little bit below, whatever. But it seems like we're converging on a level, just like we used to converge on 1.5 or 2. We're converging on the high threes, low fours, and it looks like that's happening right now. So let's talk about the. So used cars was in fact high. So the consensus estimate, as I said, for core had been rising, and partly because we expected a high used cars month-on-month figure, and it was high at 2.7%. But what's important to note, I guess, about used cars is when you look at core goods. So, all right, back up. If you look at the overall CPI, you can broadly think of it as consisting of 4 roughly equal-sized parts. And these are all 4 of these parts are between 20 and 30% of the CPI. The most volatile one is food and energy, and it's so volatile we tend to take it out. The second most volatile is core goods. Then we get core services ex shelter. That's what we call supercore. And then you have shelter. And so one of the ways I often look at this when I'm discussing the CPI is I look at these different components and say, okay, what's happening in core goods? What's happening in shelter? What can we expect to happen going forward? And that's been a pretty decent guide. Core goods in the immediate post-COVID period, we had massive money printing and we had government-induced supply constraints. Everyone's got to stay home, but so we're not producing anything, but we're going to give everybody the money to buy stuff. And so naturally you get empty shelves when that happens. And I was talking about that way back when it happened. Important to understand that in a normal recession, in a normal expansion, both the supply and demand side go up and down more or less together. And that's why you don't get why recessions and expansions don't have a high correlation. And once you take out energy, don't have a high correlation to inflations, because those two halves of the equation tend to move together. But if you airdrop lots of money to people so that the demand side keeps going while the supply side isn't, then, they're getting money, but they didn't actually do anything for it. They didn't actually build anything for it. They didn't actually provide any services for it. Then you have a mismatch of supply and demand. And that's why we got the big spike. And that looked like, supply chain problems, but the supply chain problems were significantly caused by the fact we were just giving people lots and lots of money to buy stuff that we weren't making. So it was a supply chain problem of our own making. So going back to used cars, that was the emblematic part of core goods that showed that used cars skyrocketed because we weren't making very many new cars. There were shortages of everything from the polyurethane for the seats to the various for rubber for the tires. I mean, just everything. There were all kinds of shortages, and obviously also shortage of labor because people weren't supposed to be doing a lot of working together. And so there weren't a whole lot of new cars being produced, and so everybody had lots of money. They wanted a car, and so they went out and bought used cars. That caused prices to go way up. And that in turn, having core goods spike is an important part of what caused the overall inflation to go up. Not saying that used cars was the only thing that caused overall inflation to go up, but that was sort of emblematic of what was going on the core goods side. So then we kind of reached the peak and core goods started coming down, and a lot of that had to do with the general realignments of supply and demand. But again, emblematic of that was used car prices declining and declining and declining and declining, to the point that now, if you look at from December 2019 until now, used car prices and core inflation have gone up roughly the same amount. So all of the froth, if you want to look at it that way, of used car prices has now ebbed. Now, the other part of that then is that until now, when you were looking at downward pressure on core inflation, you kind of knew that you were going to get this core goods contributor to the downside. And in fact, I kept saying that classically, I kept saying for a number of months that, hey, eventually core goods is not going to be at minus 2%. Eventually it's going to go back to small deflation or small inflation. And when that happens, something else is going to have to drive core inflation lower. And that happened. Last month, we went on core goods from minus 1.9% to minus 1%. And that's where we are again this month, minus 1% on core goods. And that's even with used cars jumping, because we still had apparel going down a lot. But again, core goods hanging out at minus 1% and probably continuing to improve from there, or get more positive, means that right now we have core inflation at 3.3, and you squeezed everything you can out of core goods. So you've got to get improvement from shelter, which we had been told should have been in hard deflation by now, and it's not. Owner's equivalent rent was 0.4% month on month last month, and in October, and primary rents were 0.3%. Both of those were higher than in September. Okay, so I think shelter is going to continue to decelerate, but it's going to get down to around 4% year on year. So that's still too high. And with core goods, no longer going down, we're going to start running out of pressure there. And so that leaves us with supercore, which, of course, is one of the things that the Fed has been focused on for a while, and for the right reasons, which is that's where you get the wage price feedback loop. Core services X shelter is where you get the labor intensive things, things like airfares or medical care, doctor's services, that sort of thing. And what drives that then, what drives supercore, is to some extent wages. Again, there's sort of a feedback loop there, that wages don't tend to go down when inflation as a whole is high. Median inflation and median wages tend to move kind of together. And median inflation, as I said, is around 4.1. So median wages are a little bit over 4% now, and coming down, but not coming down very quickly. And therefore, guess what? Supercore isn't coming down very fast. In fact, it is up month on month in this report. Okay, so we sort of have a problem that we're running out of things that have a plausible expectation that they're going to decelerate a whole lot, right? So if core goods is no longer going down and shelter isn't doing the heavy lifting of deflation, and if core services ex shelter is leveling off, then that looks like where we are right now is roughly where we're going to be, which is high threes, low fours. Now, let's see if there's any other numbers that I want to sort of point out. Energy was a little bit of a drag this month, as we expected. In the medical care was a little bit better. Pharma, medicinal drugs was minus 0.2% month on month. It had been minus 0.75. Doctor's services 0.54 had been higher than that. Hospital services 0.53 had been roughly there the month ago. We had airfares up more than 3% again, second month in a row. Did have car and truck rental declining 1.6% month on month. Honestly, not a whole lot of not a whole lot of super exciting moves in the individual individual components. I think that looking at these big clumps of food and energy, core goods, shelter, core services, shelter, is illuminating this particular month, because there weren't a whole lot of crazy things going around outside that. And it tells the story. And again, the story is high threes, low fours. Now, let's get back to the Fed, because I said at the top that the Fed is in a sort of a weird political position that they sort of put themselves into. So 2 meetings ago, there wasn't, we'd had a couple of good CPI reports, one bad one, but the market was expecting a 50 basis point ease. Very rare for the Fed to start off with a 50 basis point ease, but they did. Kind of looked a little bit political at the time, but look, if inflation was going to get back, close to target, and unemployment was going up, which it is, then getting rates at least back to neutral made some sense. Would I have done 50 basis points? No. Would I have eased at all? No. But you sort of understood politically, you understood why they did that, and of course we don't really know that there's a political slant to it right at that point. And then we get another kind of bad inflation report, and then the Fed eases another 25 basis points right before the election. Now, as for many, many years, the Fed's policy was that we don't want to make any important changes in monetary policy around the election. And in fact, back when the Fed didn't sort of go on these very regimented paths of quarter point reduction, quarter point reduction, quarter point reduction, quarter point reduction, they would actually eschew moving at all around the election because they didn't want to be seen as partisan. The whole point of the Fed is that it's supposed to be nonpartisan. It's supposed to be removed from politics so that it can't be influenced, right? And so that's why the federal FOMC governors serve for long periods of time, and it's difficult to remove a Fed governor and so on and so forth. The whole point is to immunize them from politics, and they are in return supposed to not try to influence politics. Again, it was that way for generations and generations. There were some questions because of this sudden 50 basis points that seemed unnecessary, followed by a 25 basis point ease, and Powell saying some things which suggested that he had a preferred horse in this race. It looked very, very political. So now we're in a situation, but by the way, it looked political, but there was some cover, right? As long as inflation keeps coming down, they can say, look, we're just going back to neutral and whatever. Maybe they moved a little bit early. 50 basis points still seems a little weird, but okay. Well, all right. So here we are, and we've had 3 inflation prints in a row back around 0.3. Core inflation is 3.3. Median inflation is at 4.1. None of that does not look like the stuff of additional accommodation, right? But now we have Trump. Now, if Harris had been elected, no problem. The Fed says, okay, we're not going to ease anymore. No big deal. We're not political. We just have got different data, and so we're not going to ease anymore. Until we see what happens with inflation. She wasn't elected. Trump was elected. So now they're in a bind. The right thing to do, given the data, is to not ease. Okay? Getting rates eventually back into the 4% neutral, range, but it's kind of close now. But getting it down there, okay, eventually makes some sense, but not with inflation doing what it's doing. In fact, if anything, some people are saying, gee, the Fed should tighten again. Okay, the Fed's not going to reverse policy and look really stupid. But the right thing to do anyway at this next meeting is to do nothing. And that's what they would do if Harris had been elected. It would have been the right thing to do. No politics, looks fine, whatever. The problem is now that Trump's been elected, if they don't ease, then it looks really bad. Then it really looks like, okay, we didn't have a reason to ease, but we did anyway because we wanted our dude to win. We eased again. It wasn't a good reason to. We did it anyway. We wanted our dude to win. Our dude didn't win, so now we're not going to ease anymore. Okay? Just saying that's what the narrative is. True or not, I believe the first part of that is true. I believe that the eases were mostly because they had a preferred horse. But not provable and not disprovable, but it looks really bad. And so now the Fed has to choose, okay, are we going to go ahead and ease so we can say that, look, it obviously didn't have anything to do with the politics. We thought that we needed to get rates back to neutral, so that's what we're doing, which is the wrong move. Okay, with inflation up where it is, we need additional, we don't need any more accommodation. We need less of it. Or does the Fed not do anything, which is the right monetary policy move, but looks bad politically? The short answer is that they made their own bed when they started to sort of play politics. And with Powell, again, sort of giving some vibes that he had a preferred horse, and the Fed doing some things which didn't make a whole lot of sense unless you had a preferred horse. Now it looks kind of bad. And going back to, like I said originally, the deal for many decades was, we're going to remove you, Fed, from politics so that politics can't influence you. The president, people always, said that Trump, would always rail at the Fed and try to influence them. Well, it's not just Trump. Every president ever has tried to influence the Fed. They've used the bully pulpit to say the Fed should do this, that, or the other thing. It has happened for every president. Okay. So that part's not unusual. That's the reason the Fed supposedly has its independence. Okay. But the quid-pro-quo of that independence was, okay, but Fed, you can't now go try to influence politics either. The skin of that milk has been broken. And the Fed is now in a very difficult position. It's going to look bad whatever they do. And honestly, the people who want to go and remove the independence of the Fed have some pretty good arguments. That's probably something we should talk about in another podcast. Okay, last point. And this is also the subject of a future podcast here. One of the reasons this was a premature accommodation, one of the reasons that this is all about to get very, very interesting. Okay, so for a long time when inflation was going up, very obvious what was happening, obvious what the Fed needed to do, they eventually started to do it. Inflation started to come down. The Fed clearly needed to continue doing what they were doing. They did. Inflation was coming down. Clearly, again, not a whole lot of ambiguity about what was happening and what should be happening. Some people thought we'd get into deflation and we were going to have plummeting. Anyway, that was just silly. It was very obvious for a long time that we were going to be high threes, low fours. Now we are at this potential inflection where a couple of things are happening. Not only the politics of the Fed that I just mentioned, but we also have monetary velocity more or less completing the round trip and getting back to kind of where it should have been. Other podcasts long ago, I talked about how velocity has effectively played the role of a spring connecting a trailer and a car that was speeding away. And the speeding away car was money. And so that velocity was the stretching of the spring because the economy, which is the trailer, didn't come along, and prices didn't come along as fast. But we've been watching as velocity has rebounded as expected, rebounded, but it's rebounding slower and slower. And it's almost completed a round trip, which means we are now at the point where we're looking back at money growth. And so as we complete this round trip, we are in this new point of dynamism where What's going to happen to velocity going forward? It's dependent a little bit on interest rates and on the post dynamics of the spring, and what's happening in the money supply, which is now expanding again. Way back before COVID happened, for a couple of decades, money growth was routinely in the 6 to 7% range. That's too high going forward. And so we need to see whether money supply growth is going to go back to 6 or 7, in which case we're going to end up with inflation in the low 3s or high 3s, low 4s for some time, or whether as this whole velocity spring thing completes, if money growth settles back into, say, a 4%, right, or a 3 or 4% range, which now is what we need to get the inflation that the Fed wants. So it was about to be interesting anyway. And now we have this political thing going into the whole equation. And so it's going to be very confusing and very interesting now for the next 6 months or a year at least. So you should stay tuned. But that's all for today's podcast. Please like it, subscribe it, refer others, send the link around. You can contact me at inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com. Tell me what you thought about this episode and what you want me to talk about in the future. I've got a few things I need to talk about, but always looking for new topics. You can subscribe for free to my blog at inflationguy.blog. Follow me on X at inflation_guy. Visit Enduring Investments if you need help with diagnosing and treating an inflation problem or are curious about what we do besides that. And most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.